don't see you. All right, welcome to What Gets Measured Gets Managed, Part 2. The first session we did last month in January of 2024, and we talked about some of the materiality of measurements and understanding that as your organization grows, the way you use your tools to measure information is going to change over time. And making sure that, as I think one of the comments we made, is the juice worth the squeeze, or is it worth the effort to measure and manage, depending on where your organization's at, your growth, operational maturity, things like that. So this time is part 2. It's almost like we're doing it a little bit in reverse. We're going to say, okay, well, now let's talk about some strategic goal setting and how we can decode some of that stuff. So my name's Nate. One of the folks joining here. We got Steve and Brad as well, and we'll put some contact information up on the video. Love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. But Brad, let's hand it over to you to facilitate what gets measured, gets managed, part 2 for our MSP growth kit.
Thanks, Nate, and welcome, Steve. So, look, let's talk about how do you begin to create these metrics that you're going to drive, and the first thought is begin with the end in mind, which is you want to hit a financial target, right? Like usually it's sales, right? Revenue, we're looking to generate gross margin. You have to turn that into some kind of a financial goal that you are going after. That again, it could be a revenue target at the highest level. It could be a gross margin target. It could be breaking it down into products. How do you go about setting your big picture financial topics that you then break down? Steve, I'm gonna come to you first. And then Nate, why don't you talk about what you're doing? But Steve, how do you handle that process?
First of all, it all starts on the budgeting process for us. We set a budget that we have to have meet for the company, and then we start breaking that into the individual sales team goals, where we assign individual quotas based on what the budget was that we set. I realize that not all of our listeners will have quite such a complex process or an in detail process, so I default back down to keeping it simple. And for us, really, it comes down to kind of 3 key points: new MRR, or monthly recurring revenue. So we do have a project profit goal, and then we talk about new customer or net new logo customers. We want to bring in new customers into the fold. We don't necessarily always track revenue to those. Obviously, we like to. But making sure that we're bringing new customers in, because we know once we get them in, they'll continue to grow in our stack. But we try to keep it super simple when it comes to that. And those are our high level goals.
Yeah. So Nate, how about you guys? I'm assuming when you're small, like a lot of businesses, it's a bit of a finger in the wind. Like we did this much last year, and we want to do this much this year. Talk about your budgeting process and how you turn that into something that's somewhat strategic.
Yeah, I feel that's good. I love this question. I know some folks, I've talked to other MSP owners out there, and like, I don't budget because it just gives people permission to spend money they don't need to spend. But yet, I think as your organization grows and you're really trying to delegate different levels of responsibility to different teams, being able to forecast a reasonable budget and expecting them to manage to hitting that budget is really kind of where a budget really comes into play, as Steve mentioned. But I think for us, if I go back to when I feel like we were just trying to figure out how budgeting works and how we really need to think through a budget, I remember thinking that a big part of being able to effectively budget is really knowing your organization, knowing your business, knowing the rhythm of your business, knowing the predictability of your business around how you've been executing. I'll give you an example of what I mean, where I made a mistake because I should have been vocal in an organization at this time, but I go back about a decade, and one year we were at a certain run rate of professional services in particular, and then literally we'd consistently been doing that over the last year at least. And then all of a sudden in January of the next year, as we were talking about budgeting and forecasting, we just said, hey, let's take that number plus 30%. And I remember at the time thinking, well, that sounds great on paper. I would love to do 30% more from December to January and then maintain that over the entire year. But in my head, I'm thinking this was my inexperience as a manager. And I didn't know our business enough to have confidence in the gut feeling that I had. I was like, I don't know how we're going to hit that number. Like, I don't know if we have the book of, it's not that we're miraculously going to get a book of business that can do 30% more next month. So how, like, being able to feel confident in that number and reverse engineer it to how you can execute, I think that is a high level illustration of, I think, when you're going through strategic goal setting, of being realistic about the rhythm of your business, and is it realistic for your team to be able to hit a number just because you put it on a budget. So that's, Brad, I think how that's where we started probably 10 years ago and didn't do it well, as I illustrated, but how we've really tried to grow into it and get better about aligning the strategic goals and the team's ability to hit them.
Really, I think the exercise is to think through logical next steps. When now we're working for a much larger, more, I'll call it like sophisticated engine right now. Like I'm with ConnectWise. I know we have targets where the marketing team has their own budget to go generate leads, and there's a number that they know that they need coverage wise. Like we need X amount of what our pipeline goal is in leads to be able to kind of assume that the sales team is going to be able to hit their goals, right? We need X amount of new logo needs to bring on the new customers that we want to bring on. And those are the things that, as you're growing your business, you don't really think about those things that much until you're forced to drive execution to be able to get there. Which leads me to okay, let's say you set your targets, right? We've defined this is the way we want to go. So before we talk about breaking that down, do either one of you have an example, Nate, of you talked about a goal that just seemed out of reach. But do either one of you have an example where you got this wrong and it generated the wrong kind of behaviors or focus on your sales team? Can I hear those stories occasionally? And like, what did you do there wrong? And did you course correct, or how do you fix it if you get this wrong?
Yeah, I think we've done that a couple times. I think early on, and when you talk about setting goals, your goals also need to be in alignment with where your organization is at in their growth journey. And what I mean by that's not simple to say, but what I mean by that is until we grew to the point where we needed a dedicated managed services team and a dedicated professional services team, we didn't have separate goals. It was more like finger in the air, like, hey, sales team, we need more managed services. Oh, shoot, our projects are drying up. We need more professional services. And so we'd swing the pendulum back and forth because we were just trying to get those different revenue buckets. But then as our team split, and we have dedicated managed services and professional services, then we were able to then align goals to net new managed services goals versus net new, or not necessarily net new, but driving professional services from the existing client base. But until you have some of that stuff figured out, that was definitely where we created some distraction and I think some confusion, because sales doesn't just like turn within a month or two, like, oh, we'll get some more projects, oh, let's get some more managed services. So that was one of the things that I know that we learned as far as trying to set goals as they align to, and created some confusion in our team. I don't, Brad, I'm thinking back, I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but I think that's what it made me think of when you asked, I think, where we've had problems in that regard.
Yeah, really what I'm wondering, and Steve, I'll ask you sort of the same question if you have an example of this where maybe you got it wrong, what you threw out for your salespeople to go after, and then you realize like that where behaviors are now manifesting because the comp plan and the measurements that we put in place didn't quite line up with exactly what we were trying to accomplish.
Steve, if you can't think of some, I've got something too, by the way. So,
well, I mean, the most basic that we made was a few years ago, which is probably, to Nate's point, 5, 6, 8 years ago. We all talk about MRR, monthly recurring revenue. We're laser beam focused because a lot of times that's the more difficult revenue to close. Not always, but a lot of times. So that was literally all we managed, measured, paid attention to, just laser beam focus on. That's all we spoke to the reps about. That's all we spoke to our technical team. Well, then our project margins, product and stuff just went to nothing. Well, that was the icing on top of the cake, right? Like, we were making good margin that ultimately covered a lot of our expenses by having that. And they should come along with MRR. You should be getting projects that you're selling with your MRR, depending on how you position it. So what we saw was while we saw an increase in the MRR, and you might increase your say monthly net new by 20%, it doesn't cover the financial cost increase for many, many months, because you're realizing it over time. And so we had to make a more balanced approach to go, look, don't turn down the project work. We still want to win the project work. Yes, MRR is still our primary focus, but maybe as a secondary focus, the project work is an important part of our customers and our business. And so we had to switch back to that, I guess.
Yeah. Nate, did you have an example you want to throw out?
Yeah, I think it was a really big lesson for us, and I meant to follow up on that first part, because like early on, it was the illustration that I gave where we were kind of just not aligned, and so we were swinging the pendulum. And as we grew, one of the things we made a mistake, and we've since adjusted, is that we'd set quarterly goals for our sales team, and but as a business, we would budget annually, right? We have an annual target. Of course, we want to hit it monthly and quarterly, but we set quarterly goals for the sales team, and in our minds, if the sales team, say, missed Q2's goal, they still had another couple quarters where they could maybe sell into and still hit an annual goal that we were trying to hit as a business. But the way we built the sales reps' goals and comp plans is that they had no annual target. It was only a quarterly target.
Oh, sure.
So,
right.
And we literally had this comment from one of our team members one time. They're like, because we were talking to them, oh, you missed in Q2, but you know what, you can, just kind of stretch a little bit in Q3, Q4, you can still hit your annual goal. He's like, I don't have an annual goal. I don't care about the quarter. Once it's gone, it's gone. I have zero concern about it. Yep. And because it didn't matter in their comp plan if they exceeded their Q3 and Q4 goal to hit the annual goal that we wanted to hit as a business. And so that was one of the things we changed. So now we have quarterly goals, annual goals, as well as annual stretch goals, so that even if they hit their goal, say in October, they can get some accelerated incentives to keep pushing through the end of the year to hit some of those stretch goals. So again, that's where we made those mistakes and tried to align it so that the reps' individual goals align with our business strategic goals.
Yeah, pro tip there: make sure you got a short-term and the long-term goal to make sure that that you balance the two. Okay, so let's talk about the reality that especially in the transition phase from owner-led sales to building your staff, your salespeople are not going to sell like they're an owner, both from an authority standpoint, but also from, look, if you put on paper, here's how you're going to get paid, then they're going to do the things they need to do to get paid. And if you need something else, you're probably in trouble if you don't find a way to pay them, right? So I'm assuming when we did our planning call on this, we talked about your goals and your measurements aren't strictly financial. Like, it may be, how many new customer meetings are you expected to have, and what comprises those meetings, and taking those financial goals and breaking them down another layer or two into the behaviors that you need them to exhibit to hit those goals. So Steve, how do you balance, like, hitting your financial goal, but getting the measurement right that leads to that goal, and managing that number?
Well, I think, Brad, you did a great job of kind of setting that table to suggest, as you get newer staff members or salespeople members, you focus on that activity level, because if you threw them a quota that said $1 million, just less, like, they don't even know where to start. They don't even know where to start eating that elephant, if you will. And so it all starts with, activities around, like, new customer appointments. Maybe you're going to take your owner with you on those new customer appointments. Maybe they're going to run the meeting entirely. You're going to learn from them, but it's setting, number of phone calls to set number of appointments to close new business. Ultimately is how that looks. And for us, a brand new rep has almost entirely activity based metrics, number of phone calls, number of appointments set, number of quotes generated, those kind of things. And then as we get a more tenured sales rep, so probably at that 18-month standpoint, if they're firing all cylinders, if you will, then we move to measuring revenue, because they should know that, ultimately, that's what we're measuring, is the revenue, or the margins in this case. The key is that you kind of have to, sometimes you got a more tenured rep that was firing all cylinders, and all of a sudden can't hit quota. We got to go back to measuring those activities. And so one of the benefits of being a tenured rep that's been performing, has been hitting their metrics, is they don't have to measure their activity. Like, they're responsible for hitting it. But if they stop hitting it, we go backwards.
Yeah. Nate, how about you on that question?
Yeah, that is so true. And I think, one of the things that you talked about, not, non-owner-led sales, right? So trying to convert from or transition from owner-led sales to non-owner-led sales. And you're right, the new sales reps that aren't owners are going to speak about your business differently. They're going to engage in business conversations differently. You can teach and they can learn, but they still don't have all the same experience that you have about your business. And at the same time, one of the painful lessons that I learned in this regard is that just because if you are a successful owner-led salesperson, and the things that you might innately do that lend to your success, it doesn't necessarily mean that your sales reps are going to do the exact same thing or even execute the activities in the same way. So that was one of the biggest mistakes I made. I just well, this is how you do it. I just presumed that anybody that wanted to be in sales, that this is what they do, like networking, for example. So that's where I start, is like looking back at exactly as Steve mentioned, especially if you're onboarding, what are the key behaviors? Like, one of the things that I think we hear from a lot of MSP owners that are trying to hire salespeople is they get frustrated and they have a lack of expectation of when should they let a salesperson go, right? Expectation, by the way, that a net new salesperson is going to generate any revenue for the first 6 months. But does that mean that we don't measure anything before 6 months? Of course not. We have very specific 30, 60, 90-day milestones. And in the first 90 days, in particular, if they make it past their 30, which not everyone does, by the way, but if they make it past their 30, well, then the next 60 days is they gotta set, for us, it's a minimum of 6 first meetings with prospects, not like a vendor or networking partner, with prospects. And so that 6 first meetings is one of the key milestones. And then all the things, whether they're doing LinkedIn Sales Navigator, if they're going to networking groups, so we have other behaviors around those things. But ultimately, the results that we're looking for in the first 90 days is setting first meetings, because it's unlikely that we're going to generate a revenue in the first 90 days. And so we hopefully that those first 90 days, 120 days, someone in there is going to generate a client by 6 months is really our hope, is we get a client by around the 6-month mark. So and then from the 6-month mark is when we really start measuring consistent new revenue that we expect from them. 8 clients and $40K of MRR a year is what we expect moving forward. So a client basically every other month, and $40K of MRR net new every year. But that first 6 months, it's all about behaviors. And I would agree with you too, Steve, is that as you get more tenured and you've demonstrated your ability to hit revenue targets, we don't scrutinize activities as much, but I can tell you that sometimes your experience works against you. And if you're not doing the proactive things like consistently networking, and that's the big one for me, is that look, you got to be out there at least, 3-4 times a month. If you're a hunter, early on, it should be way more than that. But even if you have a good pipeline, you should keep the pipeline growing by making sure you're getting out and networking. And so that's one of the things in our weekly one-on-ones, we are asking, have you gone to a networking event? How many have you done this month? And how many have you done this week? Because we want people to be out there to continually fill their pipeline, so they don't all of a sudden close the deals and now they have 0 pipeline because they haven't been doing anything proactive to build it. So those are some of the things I think that we've worked on, Brad.
Yeah. Do you guys define some of those things? Again, my mind always goes back to, you start with owner-led sales and we're trying to grow a staff, and owner-led brings in the first person and they're probably kind of connected at the hip while the owner does some of these things. And by osmosis, they just understand what an introductory meeting is. But by the time you get to the point where you have a staff, is a new client meeting, they're not all the same. How do you how do you use the numbers and the metrics to kind of gauge effectiveness? Just because you tick the box doesn't mean you accomplished what we want to accomplish. Nate, I'll start with you, and then Steve, I'll come to you on how you guys do that.
Yeah, it's so it's two things. I think, Brad, is some high level ratios between milestone stages of a sales process, and then also using those milestones as your onboarding method and template, right? So for instance, for us and what we coach with our team is look, the first step is they got to be able to get these first meetings, right? So coaching on some of those things, depending on their experience level, but holding those first meetings, my suggestion is that whomever is the authority or the coach in this regard, whether it's a sales owner or maybe another senior peer, if you have another rock star that can be a coach on your team, they ride alongside that person until they both feel comfortable that the new rep can execute that piece autonomously, right? So and then once that's done, like, okay, now I can wipe my hands or walk away from having to walk alongside every meeting with them. Doesn't mean that they don't invite somebody in because of the meeting opportunity and they want to do team selling, and that's fine. But then looking at the next phase of your sales process and like, can they execute that autonomously? And then the next phase and the next phase. So it's these key steps in the sales process and making sure that you walk alongside your rep until they have enough repetitions and experience, and that you and they feel comfortable to execute them autonomously. Doesn't mean they execute them always autonomously because of team selling, but at least that you feel comfortable that they can execute them autonomously. So that's really the big one for us. And then a couple things on those milestones for us too is that one of those ratios is like, we know that if it's a marketing driven lead, we have it's about one client for every 10 first meetings. All right. So if we get 10 first meetings with a prospect, usually one of them will become a client on average. Now that if you go then to our next qualification phase, so like first meeting to where we do kind of a business and technical assessment, if you will. I won't get into the details of what that should look like. That's a whole nother conversation. But we have actually the most significant drop off in our sales process between that first meeting and that qualification, because we do heavy qualifying there. So we have 50 to 60% drop off in that phase. But once we get that milestone, that assessment milestone, I'll just call it that, we have a 70+% probability of then winning them as a client. So we can have some of these key ratios that we look at, and your ratios might be different than ours, but just to give you an illustration so that you can see how a rep's executing. And so if they're not, especially if you get enough team members where you can measure these different team members executing in different ways, you might see that one team member doesn't have a high of ratio of closing after that assessment phase. Well, now they've got something to work on. Maybe they're not qualifying well enough. So there's things like that you work on, but that's really how we walk through the onboarding as well as key major milestones in the sales process.
Yeah. Steve, how about you? How do you guys make sure the activities are quality activities?
Honestly, can't disagree with anything Nate says. And as I think back to that transition from owner-led sales into, further in that journey, I think Nate did a great job of saying, like, the first thing you just measure them. Then you kind of apply one just like qualifier, and as you get better at applying those, like you're bowling with bumpers and you're getting narrower and narrower until you can bowl without bumpers, and right. I think that's what really is the story here. The key is like keep it simple early, like set some appointments. So yeah, they may not be great appointments, but you set an appointment. So you went on and the customer wasn't well qualified. They're not even a great customer. Okay, don't do that again. And so I think
it's a learning opportunity.
It's a learning opportunity. So I think that's probably the way I would describe this. Nate and I are more seasoned, where we have very defined sales processes of what qualifying means, what an opportunity, what our target customer, like they're very narrowly defined. But early, like to your point, Brad, we didn't have a lot of definitions. Set an appointment. That was our definition, and we weren't good at that either. And then we just got a little better every time until we started documenting it. And then every time we documented, we got a little bit better and more mature at each step.
Yeah. So we talked about not changing you can't change their comp plan, right? Like probably yearly, unless something really is off the rails, but then you're in trouble. But if you're not changing comp plans, how often do you guys, or did you, as you were kind of growing, maturing, change the expectation around the activities or the behaviors? Would you change that throughout the year to make them more effective, or is it more of the, if you're hitting your numbers, we'll leave you alone, and if you're not, then we're going to focus on making sure that you're doing the right things?
Well, I mean, Brad, I think the answer depends on who we're talking about. If you're a brand new rep with an owner-led sales engine and there wasn't a lot of, anything going on there, like every month you might change a little bit of the metric as they get good at each stage. So, maybe that first stage is making, setting an appointment. Okay, now we're good at that. So now we're going to, move your metric to, qualifying, the first meeting. And then maybe it's quoting, and then, like you're moving through the process. If you're a more tenured rep, then I move through that way faster. And quite frankly, I shouldn't be changing their metrics all that often, to your point, maybe annually based on that. Nate, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I would agree. I think a new rep, I mean, part of it's also learning, they might be the most phenomenal cold caller ever and only need 8 touches instead of 17 touches to get a first meeting, right? So like, I do think there's some recognition of that, and eventually measuring on results is the ultimate goal. However, I think the biggest risk that we have, even with tenured reps, and the phrase that I've used with some of a couple of the most experienced reps that we have on our team that are, by the way, one of them has been in the industry for more than 20 years and one of them has been in the industry more than 15. So I'm talking seasoned MSP professional sales representatives here, is that their experience can work against them, because they've had so much success. They forget to do the basics, and sometimes they forget to do the networking, and sometimes they forget to do the qualifying. And again, I've made this mistake myself, by the way, where I'm thinking, well, obviously the prospect is going to recognize my brilliance and my experience in the industry, so I don't need to make sure that I ask great questions. I don't need to follow up as well. I don't need to, all these kind of things, but you do, right? And I think that's where sometimes a manager sometimes, and I did this, is less inclined to poke at the key behavior metrics like networking, like asking for referrals, like giving referrals, some of those things with your senior reps, because they've proven their performance. But those are the kind of things that sometimes senior reps get themselves into trouble because they're not doing some of those basics that they know build the pipeline over time. So I just do encourage, like, give some grace and understand what's going on. Like, if they're slammed with prospects, well, yeah, maybe they're not going to spend as much time networking, but those are sometimes the times when you really need to make sure that you make the time to do it so that your pipeline doesn't run dry 3 months from now. So that's, I think, how we kind of dynamically address it, is be realistic about what's going on. Like, we did an acquisition a couple years ago, and one of our reps, who's an account manager, we dumped a whole bunch of new accounts from the acquisition on him. And so I didn't have any expectation. I had very specific expectations about that, but there are other things that normally I would have expected, but I just ate up all his excess time from an account manager perspective. So I didn't do that. So, like, I think there's some awareness of the situation that you need to be aware as a manager to manage through or communicate through. But the biggest thing, don't let your experience work against you, and don't forget those key activities that got you to where you're at and that will contribute to for your future success.
All
So
right.
Nate, I'm going to poke you just a little bit on the Nate. You
Please.
say manage, but really you mean coach, right? Like,
Yeah,
listening
I mean,
what's happening there, adjusting their batter stance, if you will. You got your baseball jersey on, so I have to go that way. But yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is coaching. Yeah.
I'm mindful of our time. We got about 3 minutes left. We maybe stretch it into 4. But here's what we're talking about today. We talk about setting the right financial metrics. Make sure you get those right, your goals, and then breaking them into kind of the activities and the things that you need in measuring and managing / coaching those things. So 2 quick questions. We got to be quicker on these. And so maybe Nate, I'll come to you for one, and Steve, I'll come to you for the other one. Nate, your question is, ideally, when are you building this? When are you building this, and like how much of your time and effort goes into building kind of your comp / measurement plan, and when are you building it relative to your fiscal year beginning?
Yeah, so ideally, and I have not yet hit this goal ever, but ideally, you're presenting it in October of the previous year to start in January. That is my target, is that you're presenting at the beginning of October to give your reps a quarter. Most of the time we've been presenting them in January to team members, or sometimes in December. I am trying to do better at that. But I also can say that we've had over the years, lots of iterations of comp plans, and as we've gotten at them, we're making fewer changes. They're just little tweaks, right?
Yeah.
They're not like big
Right.
swings. Like early on, we had some big swings. And if you're doing that, you definitely want to give your team way more notice than like telling them at the end of January their comp plan that started 30 days ago. But I think as you get better at it, when you're just making the minor tweaks, like we made a tweak of going to 22% margin on one-time product instead of 20%, for example, this year. That's a minor thing. It's not a big deal. The team was hit it for the most part anyway. So, but if you're making some big swings, I would say the earlier the better. But yeah, that's how we do it, Brad.
Good answer. Steve, here's your question. I'm assuming you oversubscribe your quota a bit. Like if your goal's $1 million in new revenue, your quotas are for $1 million plus something. How much do you, I'll use the term oversubscribe, how much do you over quota to hit your financial targets?
The direct answer is 10%. The more complicated answer is new reps, those kind of things. We're giving a little more. We're assuming they may not hit it, and so we're making sure that so our more tenured reps have that 10% over the other ones. We're just assuming they may not hit it, so we have enough budget on the rest of the reps to hit the target.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Good stuff. So, if you take away anything on this, it's set your financial targets and make sure that you pick the right chunky targets and don't leave anything out. Have short-term goals and long-term goals, so salespeople don't either like have it so far out they can never really realize what they're actually earning, or make it so that if they missed a number, there's no incentive for them to try to make it up throughout the year. Right? And then break it down into the activities and define those activities. And again, depending on your maturity level, probably in what mode you're in, that's going to look different. But look, get out there and build a sales staff, right? Like these challenges are not going to get easier. They're not going to get simpler. Get something on paper and let's roll with it. We'll pivot next year and be better. So, okay. Thanks for taking some time today. Next month, we are going to talk target customer profile, average deal customer size. Right? We're going to take, okay, now you got your financial goals. Like, how does target customer profile and deal size play into some of those things and how you're going to do it? So we need you to smash the subscribe button. It's here or here. It's probably, I'm not sure, it might be here, but either way, smash the subscribe button. We have some Stephanie in the background recording a bunch of short little videos that are nuggets that we're going to get out for you, but you're only going to be made aware of them if you subscribe or you keep coming back. So subscribing is easier. Smash away, right? That's what our ask is. All right, Nate and Steve, any final words of wisdom? I know it's a kind of a capstone question, but what's your encouragement? And then we're going to let these guys go. Yeah, Steve, I'll go. Steve, you're first.
Measure something. If you're not measuring anything today, pick one thing. Revenue, doesn't matter. Pick something, measure it. Then you can at least have a starting place.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would. So what I'll add is do that and iterate, as Steve mentioned. And the one like hidden behavior that has dramatically changed our success that I didn't even think about is not measuring how many referrals your team asks for, but measuring how many they give. If your team gives referrals, they're in the position to receive referrals, and that's what sets them up to build a great pipeline.
Nice. I like it. All right, Nate and Steve, thank you. Everybody, thanks for listening in. We will be back next month talking target customer profile.